Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, former New York Times freelance reporter Jere Van Dyk talks about the unexpected result of his last trip to Afghanistan, which he details in his new book, Captive: My Time as a Prisoner of the Taliban. The acclaimed author of In Afghanistan, An American Odyssey, talks with New Yorker staff writer George Packer from Book Expo America in New York.
Welcome to Book TV's Afterwards. I'm George Packer, here with Jere Van Dyk, who is the author of Captive: My Time as a Prisoner of the Taliban. Nice to meet you, Jere. And we're going to lean in a little bit because it's not exactly an intimate studio here at the Javits Center. Your book is a truly gripping account, day by day, in a sort of diary form, of the 44 days you spent as a captive of the Taliban in the mountains of northwestern Pakistan, and the events that led up to that, and your ultimate release. Just tell us what you were doing in the most dangerous place on earth, the borderland between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where no foreigner dares to go, and certainly no foreigner who's looking to spend a few weeks traveling with the Taliban. What were you doing there?
I had been there, or I'd passed through there a few times in the 1980s when I was a freelance reporter for the New York Times. I'd gone from Peshawar down into Miram Shah, into Waziristan, and hiked up into the mountains into Paktia province, lived with Jalaluddin Haqqani, came out.
Who was one of the leading Mujahideen fighters during the war against the Soviet Union.
Just beginning. He was just starting. This was in the very early stages of the war. So many years later, 2006, what I began to do in late November was to go up for the first time since 1981 up into the mountains. I was looking for where Pat Tillman was killed. And so it was the first time in decades that I had worn a turban, that I started to let my beard grow long again. And while I was up there, I went up there twice, about 5 kilometers, a few miles from the border where Tillman was killed. I realized that things in so many ways had not changed, and it began to dawn on me that I could try to live as I had lived before in the 1980s, and maybe, just maybe, using the contacts I had before, my knowledge of the culture, my background in Afghanistan, in Washington, I could try to do what no other person could do, and that was to penetrate the tribal areas.
You thought your experience there in the 80s, the fact that you seem to have a knack for blending in, both in Kabul and in the Pashtun areas. You spoke, I guess, a bit of Pashtun, maybe some Dari.
Not really, maybe 5 or 6 words of Dari,
right.
But no.
I mean, it's, as someone who's been a correspondent in both Iraq and Afghanistan, it's a staggeringly audacious thing that you tried to do, to blend in enough that you'd be able to cross over that line between the warring sides and be accepted by the Taliban enough to be allowed to travel with them because of your old connections from the 1980s.
In retrospect, I realize that it sounds, and it was, in so many ways, suicidal. But I didn't think that at the time. I'd had this long background in Afghanistan. I'd had the experience as doing exploration work for National Geographic in hard places in other parts in the world. I felt that physically, because of my background in athletics as a youth, that I could do this. Secondly,
you were a track star in high school and college. You competed in the Olympic trials.
Right.
What was your event?
I ran 1,500 meters. I ran the 800 meters in my 20s, and then as late 20s, I ran the 1,500 meters. And so I still held on to this fitness, and I knew I could handle it physically. I wanted to handle it physically. I wanted the challenge. I wanted to do something for reasons that I was not aware of then that were harder than anything I'd ever done before. I wanted to accomplish something. I wanted to find out in my own way what I felt other people, whether newspaper reporters or editorialists or intelligence people or White House officials, whether Bush or Obama administrations, were not telling us. I didn't believe what Pakistan was saying. I didn't believe, in my somewhat naive way, but based upon all this experience I'd had over the years. Plus, I'd worked in Washington in the 80s, somewhat as a consultant to the State Department and the NSC on Afghanistan, that I had this long background. I didn't believe everything. I thought I could do it. Finally, I felt I had a responsibility because of my background to do it, and mostly, I wanted to do something really, really hard. Really hard.
Did you have a hypothesis? You say several times at the beginning of the book you wanted to find out what was really happening in the Taliban areas. What was your notion of what was happening that you weren't hearing from journalists and intelligence officers and analysts?
My knowledge, somewhat limited, but still existed, a Pashtun culture, my knowledge of Pashtunwali, everything that I had.
Which is the way of the Pashtun, the code of behavior of the Pashtun that goes back centuries.
Correct. And my experience with Haqqani and Pashtunwali, and where Islam and Pashtunwali came together, where competed with one another, and my experiences with that, very limited, but nonetheless existed, in Kandahar in the 1980s. I had this feeling that I would always be protected.
That as a guest, it would be their highest duty as Pashtuns to protect you.
That is right. In Pashtunwali, more than anything else, fundamentally it depends upon honor, iftikhar. That goes to the heart of what a Pashtun is. The man, I also felt that I was part of a network, that I would, because of this, be protected. I went to see, in the 1980s when I was with Haqqani, I first went with a man named Yunus Khalis. He was still alive in 2003 and 2004 when I went to see him. I felt I was the only journalist allowed to see him. The man that had arranged for me to go into the tribal areas the last time I went had been a commander under Yunus Khalis in the 1980s. Haqqani was part of this network. The man who I was supposed to go see had unfortunately killed another man that I knew. I got caught in a very dangerous, delicate dispute.
You were going to see a somewhat lower-ranking commander named Abdullah.
Correct. Yeah. And he is responsible, according to everybody, for being a part of the assassination of one of the former vice presidents of Afghanistan. He wanted to come back into the fold. He wanted to come in from the cold. My commander in Afghanistan said, if you go with him, he will protect you because he needs me to come back into Afghanistan.
So basically, you used an arrangement that was being established between an Afghan politician in Kabul and a Taliban commander in the mountains who were trying to set up a deal whereby the Taliban guy could be reintegrated. And you used their mutual arrangement to get to the Taliban.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. But by the time you ended up in those mountains, journalists had been kidnapped in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Journalists had been killed. An Afghan interpreter named Ajmal Nashkabani had been beheaded.
True.
So Pashtunwali had not saved some people. Wasn't that in the back of your mind when you made this decision to go into the mountains?
I had, prior to this final trip across, been with the Taliban 4 times. I had gone with them twice in Kunar. I had been up on a 6-hour hike south of Tora Bora with the Taliban with a Predator overhead. I had gone into Chitral twice. I had crossed into Momand Agency already. I thought, each time when I was with the Taliban, I was scared to death. Each time I didn't know that I would get out, but each time I did get out. And they said prior to this, we will protect you. I was relying upon what I had done in the past and that I could say to them, I was here before. I'm not like a normal journalist who has come now, who doesn't understand you. I was here when your backs were against the wall. I've written this book. I've been with Haqqani. I've been with Hekmatyar.
Your first book was called In Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan. Right. And I thought because of that.
This was cred. This would be good street cred with the Taliban.
Street cred.